I want to start the story off by saying that I am Navajo, and boy, have I heard a lot of stories growing up on the res. While I've never seen anything myself, which I'm actually grateful for, I have benefited by being around the people who have. There's a different kind of evil that lives in the quiet high deserts and in the deep canyons of Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, even Colorado in the southern area. I can only describe it as an ancient evil. Now there are helpful ceremonies, rituals, and traditions that are still practiced to this day. Hell, even a local hospital has an on-duty medicine man, but it seems to be a double-edged sword. What I mean is there is also black magic, which most Navajo will not even acknowledge or speak of. We are very superstitious. You will find this with most First Nation people. From Alaska to Argentina, it's just something you don't do, in fear that it will get the attention of unwanted spirits or harmful entities. Skinwalkers or naaldlooshii are just a few stories that kept me up at night with the covers over my head. So here's a quick one for you guys. A Navajo tribal police officer was driving west on what used to be officially named Highway 666. It was lightly snowing, maybe 1/4 of an inch, which is a lot of snow for home, and he sees an old woman walking on the side of the road. How she got there, or where she was going, was apparent because she was so far out in the middle of nowhere. He didn't see her right away, but as he passes, he noticed that she is dressed in traditional clothing, a dress, a shawl, and her hair in a traditional bun. This actually isn't too odd. Many elders still choose to dress traditionally. But why was she out in such cold weather? And this late at night? Hitchhiking? Maybe. He passed her too quickly and now has to turn around. And as he makes a U-turn, he notices she is nowhere to be seen. This is fairly flat terrain, and he for sure saw an old woman walking. He pulls the squad car over and steps out with his flashlight. Confused, he manages to find the woman's footprints in the snow. He follows the footprints until they suddenly turn into what looked like dog footprints, leading away from the road in a hurry. He immediately jumps back into the squad car and meets up with another officer near his patrol. He is a little shaken up, but then tells the other officer if he has ever seen anything like that. The other officer tells him that he has. He also explains that sometimes it's an old woman, sometimes a very beautiful young girl, but always on that road and always in the snow, waiting for the right Good Samaritan to let her into their car. I still get nervous driving those wide open spaces at night. I keep my eyes strictly on the road and turn my music up high. I rarely ever pick up hitchhikers, but I for sure will never pick one up at night. So let this be a warning to each and every single one of you, that if you ever come around this area, or what used to be called Highway 666, don't ever pick up a hitchhiker. It might just be a skinwalker taking you home. I was in prison for 15 years. There was a skinwalker in there with us. A little background first. I was serving a 15-year sentence in a penitentiary in South Arizona. What I was in there for isn't important, but when I was staying there were countless things that happened that no one could explain, and even more that no one wanted to know more about. It all started with a prison legend. They said that years ago, something awful and unexplainable happened in the prison. Every morning we would wake up and be expected to stand near the front of our cells, while guards visually confirmed we were present and accounted for. Apparently, about a year before I got sent there, the most brutal and unexplainable thing happened during one of those routines. A man who had a cell to himself looked very off. When the guard saw this, he pulled over another guard to help him check it out. They found it wasn't actually the prisoner they were expecting at all. It was a totally different man. And this man was wearing the skin of the other man over him. But apparently, it looked like a real monster. The scariest thing was that the guy wearing the skin was not an inmate. They had no idea how he even got into the prison. What's worse is that they couldn't even figure out who the hell he was. He wasn't documented anywhere. And what's worse than that, they never even found the body of the man of the skin he was wearing. Pretty scary stuff, I know. And I realize that's not the go-to definition of a skinwalker. But that's what the prison called him, the skinwalker. It didn't help out that the guy never talked apparently. Anyways, that's what started the whole skinwalker superstition around the yard. Apparently, the guy got shipped to a different spot about a month after it happened, and just about everyone here felt all the better for it. I heard about the story on the second day of my stay. Hell of a story to hear, to place in your home for the foreseeable future. Now, onto the real shit though. Sure, that guy was the skinwalker, but all he did in the long run was get an old Navajo inmate to tell everyone about actual skinwalkers. It seemed like a lot of the prison culture actually revolved around them. Now apparently, skinwalkers are tricky to point out on the spot, but if you manage to survive around one for more than a minute or two, almost everyone can tell the mannerisms. They can mimic human speech, but not replicate it. They twitch manically. They have an unnatural gait while walking, but apparently they got better with experience. The old Navajo guy, his name was Carl, said that he was sure there was an actual one among the prisoners, slowly picking us off over the years. He called it the Grandmaster Skinwalker at one point. Apparently he thought it had human mannerisms down so well that you might not even been able to tell if it was your cellmate for a day or two. He would expect the skinwalker to jump at any opportunity for a kill. But this one realized it had a revolving door of people to kill coming to it. A lot of guys found humor in it. A lot more were really on the edge about it. And every once in a while, in prison, people snap. Sometimes, you will find your cellmate swinging in front of the bunk, strung up around the neck by his pants. Sometimes, you just can't take it anymore. But in our yard, people tended to snap in a very special way. It wouldn't be an outburst at dinner or a silent suicide in the night. Guys would just stop talking, hunch over, and shuffle around. Any friendships they had would be mostly out the window. They would turn into a loner during rec time. They would let their hair hang in front of their face. No one liked to talk about it. Like, if they did, it would happen to them next. I felt the same way too. I didn't know if it was a skinwalker or people just going crazy. But I didn't want to find out. It wasn't clockwork or anything. But every time someone snapped in this way, it wasn't more than a couple weeks before they were, quote, shipped off or, quote, transferred to God knows where without anyone else knowing beforehand. Then there were the nighttime occurrences. Short and a loud burst of sound echoed through my cell block during all hours of the night on a regular basis. It sounded like a mix between a pig dying squeals and nails on a chalkboard. Just another thing no one liked to talk about. Even scarier were the shadows and footsteps. The block was dimly illuminated in the night by a few lights hanging from the ceiling outside the cells. I myself saw shadows fill across my wall on a regular occasion. One time, near the end of my sentence, I woke up, looked at my back wall, and found the perfect silhouette of a person standing there. But when I looked, my bunkmate was asleep, and no one was really outside my call. And the footsteps, everyone hated the fucking footsteps. They were the scariest part. In the night, sometimes, more rarely than the shadows, you would hear ungodly, fast footsteps. They sounded like wet feet slapping on the tile floor. Whatever caused them would fly from one end of the block to the other in a dead sprint. Whatever it wasn't human-like, and it was very fast. If you happened to be awake before it started, by the time you heard the footsteps on one side of your cell and whipped your head around to see the thing run by, it sounded like it was 3 cells past you. Everyone hated those fucking footsteps. And I agree. I thought they were the worst. I was released from that place about a month ago. I have more stories than I can count. I swear it was nearly my turn. About a week before I was discharged, my cellmate and a good friend of mine snapped. In the same kind of way, I didn't sleep for an entire week. Well, I did sleep of course, but never for more than a few minutes at a time. Never turned my back on the guy. The scariest thing though, was when I woke up one night to him, somehow, snaking his body through the bars of our cell. For reference, I couldn't get anything past my shoulder through them. And the worst part of all of this was that he was coming back in to our cell. On the day of my release, I didn't say a word to him, just left, and he seemed fine with it, and so was I. I had made it through 15 years of prison fights, gang disputes, and for all I know, Skinwalker abductions. I left through the front gate, a free man. As I walked along the fence for the rec yard, I spotted my cellmate, standing off on his own, similar to how he was for the last week or so. I shook my head, not even really sure if it was him anymore. I took one last look over the yard, this time from the other side of the fence, and I wish I hadn't. There, standing off on his own, on the other side of the yard, was Carl, slouched over, looking at the other inmates, and twitching manically. Jacob cursed as he pushed through the thick underbrush, trying to make his way to the tree stand he had built earlier in the summer. He was for sure that this location would give him a good sight to the neighboring field, in which he frequently saw large herds of deer. This was going to be his year, and he was sure of it. This is the year that I bring home my trophy buck, he told himself, as he recalled the events of the day so far. He had awakened at 4:30 a.m. He began to get ready for the long day in the woods, on the backside of his farm. His first order of business had been to locate and rescue his gloves and camouflage hunting gear from whatever undisclosed area of his home that his wife had hidden them. He was gonna need them this morning to protect him from the bitter cold November morning. How could it be this cold, this early in the year? He wondered as he started to work on his second task of the day, which was to make a breakfast that would stick to his ribs long into the day. But he finally settled on toast, country ham, and scrambled eggs. He topped it all off with a large cup of coffee that had left a bitter aftertaste in his mouth. In fact, he could still taste it. After this, he packed himself a cheese sandwich for lunch. He grabbed his Remington hunting rifle, some coffee, and headed out the door. He loaded his gear into his truck and pulled out of the driveway and turned right into the one-lane blacktop road that led to the backside of his property. After about 2.25 miles, he turned right again. He had to travel about half a mile down that pitiful rut-filled excuse for a road when he came to his desired location. He then got out of his truck and loaded his gun and walked off into the woods. 10 minutes out of the truck and he was already cold, and it was made worse by the cloudy, overcast day and the wind that was blowing through the trees, making all the leaves rattle like dry bones. Oh well, he thought, it's gonna be a good day anyway, especially if I bring home a big one. Jacob took about 10 more steps when an uneasy feeling began to creep over him. He felt as though someone had stepped over his grave. He got the distinct feeling that he was being watched, but by whom? This was, after all, his property, and it was posted. No one had permission to be on his land. He had to be alone, but if he was alone, why couldn't he shake this eerie feeling that was scratching at the base of his skull? Something was off today. There was a silence in the forest. No birds, no insects, only the sound of the wind in the trees. Convincing himself that it was nothing more than a case of nerves, he continued to press on until he came to a clearing, not too far from his tree stand. Stepping into the clearing, Jacob saw the remains of what appeared to be a large deer, but he wasn't quite able to make out what he was seeing from this distance, because the sun wasn't completely up yet, and the forest was still covered in shadows. Jacob then walked closer to get a better look, and found that he had been correct. It was a deer, a large 8-point buck in fact. Looking at the remains, he felt a sense of dread come over him, and icy fingers dance along his spine. Something about this kill just didn't seem right. The throat was completely torn out, and the stomach was ripped open. Plus, also several of the internal organs were missing. This definitely wasn't a coyote kill, and no hunter would have done this. They would have taken the head to have it mounted. What could have done this, he wondered. A fear like nothing he had ever experienced before began to wash over him in waves. What is going on? He thought. At nearly 225 pounds and well over 6 foot, he wasn't one to give in to fear, but now he couldn't seem to calm down, and his heart was beating like a trip hammer. That feeling that he was being watched was getting stronger by the minute, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was moments away from a bad situation. He slowly started to back away from the mangled body and head back to his truck and back to safety. No more than 6 steps into his journey, his blood turned to ice in his veins as a deep, guttural scream shattered the eerie silence and what was left of his courage. He had grown up on the farm all of his life and had been an experienced hunter since he was a child. He was familiar with every animal in the part of the state. Fear now gave way to stark terror as he chambered around into his Remington rifle and turned around only to find there was nothing behind him. His mind raced with confusion, and he was confronted with a million thoughts at once. What should I do? What could it be? Should I run? Am I gonna die? His survival sense kicking into overdrive. Jacob decided to continue on his previously contrived plan, which was to get to the truck and get out of there. Slowly and cautiously, he made his way toward the perceived salvation of his vehicle, silently praying every step of the way. With 300 yards separating him from his only avenue of escape, Jacob began to hear heavy footfalls off to his left. He could hear the crunching of withered leaves, sticks, and the breeze that littered the forest floor. Summoning every ounce of courage that remained within him, he forced himself to look in the direction of the noise. And that is when he saw the dark silhouette that followed him through the forest. Quickening his pace, he redoubled his efforts to reach the truck and get to a phone and call the sheriff, the game warden, or anyone that would listen. He couldn't tell what it was that was stalking him, but he could clearly see that it towered more than 7 feet and was incredibly massive. Jacob couldn't help but think that he was about to become a national statistic, a person who left home under normal circumstances and just disappeared without a trace. How many people, he wondered, go into the woods and just vanish, and the authorities just assume that they have become lost, injured, or been the victims of animal attacks, with their bodies never recovered. Please God, don't let that happen to me, he told himself as he drew closer and closer to his truck. 75 yards became 50, and 50 became 30, and 30 became 10. And like a miracle, he was back and opening his door. Throwing his rifle inside, he pulled himself up into the cab and started the engine and hit the gas. But the truck went nowhere. He had parked in a puddle of mud, and now the tires simply spun in place. Not now, he thought. I can't be stuck. Allowing himself a moment to think, Jacob remembered, this truck is a 4-wheel drive. There is no way I can be stuck, and was ready to punch the gas and leave this nightmare behind. Unfortunately for Jacob, some nightmares are not so easily left behind, and there is nothing worse than a nightmare you can't wake up from. And Jacob was about to learn that the hard way. Hearing something to his right, he turned and immediately wished that he had not. It took him maybe half a second to turn his head, but he would have given anything in the world to have that half second back, because it was the last moment that his world would ever see normal again. In that split second, his world changed. It was no longer a place where the world was light and safe, where he was just a husband and a dad and a guy that liked to go hunting and watch football on the weekends. That reality had evaporated away, and all that was left was a world where monsters existed and things really do go bump in the night. And now, an ambassador from that nightmare realm was standing just outside his passenger door, a visible reminder that his world had been turned upside down. Jacob screamed as he stared transfixed on this escapee from a horror movie. In his most terrifying, fevered dream, he couldn't have imagined that such a thing could exist. It was hideously ugly, easily standing 8 feet tall, with a thick, muscular body. There was just something about that face that was just wrong, almost like a mixture of a man and an animal experiment that had gone horribly wrong. It was the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. It was completely covered with thick, shaggy black hair that was matted in areas with God only knows what, and it walked on 2 legs, not on 4 legs, like you would expect from some kind of animal. What was this thing that had shattered his perception of reality? Was it a demon? Was it a werewolf? It can't be, he thought. Those things don't exist. But whatever it was staring at him, and it didn't look happy. The menacing juggernaut threw its enormous head back and let out a blood-curdling scream that resonated throughout the surrounding area and seemed to vibrate him to his very core. Shocked back into action, Jacob threw his truck into gear and took off as though he was being chased by the very hounds of hell. Jacob, with his mind racing, wondered what he was going to do. How will I ever feel safe on this farm again, he thought. Are my wife and children in danger? What And where did this thing come from? And will anyone believe me? The whirlwind of thoughts that swirled through Jacob's mind came to an immediate stop as he slammed on his brakes and nearly slid off the road. In a state of disbelief, Jacob sat staring at the large hackberry tree that laid across the dirt road and blocked his path, preventing him from reaching the black top and guarantee safety. How is this even possible? He thought. I just came down this road not even 30 minutes ago, and this path was clear. It was painfully obvious to Jacob that he had to get that tree moved if he was going to make it back home, since he didn't have a chain to pull the tree out of the road, nor did he have a saw with which he could cut up the unexpected barricade. He was left with a few options, one of which was walking, which he discounted immediately. The most logical course of action that he could come up with was to call for help. His best friend Kenny Patterson owned the farm just over from his. If he were home, he could bring a saw and cut the tree up for him. Jacob, with his nerves still frazzled and frayed, reached into his glove box and pulled out his cell phone and dialed Kenny's number. The phone rang 6 times, and Jacob was about to give up when Kenny answered the phone and said, "Hey ugly, what do you want this early in the morning?" As quickly as he could, he told the recent events to Kenny and said, "Please, hurry, I'm not kidding, there is something out here." Kenny, hearing the shakiness in his friend's voice, assured him that he would be there in a matter of minutes. Jacob thanked him and hanged up the phone, and braced himself for what he was sure would be the longest few minutes of his life. Sitting motionless inside of his truck, every sound made his imagination run wild with fear. Even though little more than 3 minutes had passed since he had spoken to Kenny, it felt as if hours had passed. The clock seemed to be an eternity. Jacob frequently checked in all directions for any sign to see if this nightmarish monstrosity had pursued them. In every shadow that the forest and on this cloudy day produced, he thought he saw the shape of the black beast that had followed him out of the woods, and he was afraid that he would lose himself long before Kenny arrived to clear the tree out of his path. After what seemed like a lifetime, Jacob heard the sound of Kenny's old truck sputtering up the road, and in just moments, he was able to see the old red Chevy as it made its way closer to him. Jacob's spirits lifted when he saw his old friend, and a sense of relief washed over him as he realized that he was no longer alone. Stepping out of his truck, Jacob said, "Man, what took you so long? I told you to hurry." Kenny, with a surprised look on his face, "What are you talking about? You only called me 11 minutes ago. I think I made pretty good time." Jacob could hardly believe that only 11 minutes had passed. It had seemed so much longer. After apologizing to his friend and telling him exactly how happy he was to see him, both men walked over to the fallen tree and made a discovery that startled them both. The tree had not broken. It had not been cut. It had been pushed over and completely uprooted. All around the tree were large bipedal footprints that had a somewhat human appearance to them. But if they were human, the owner would require a size 28 shoe. Jacob and Kenny looked at each other, and then without a word, went to work on the tree. Kenny took a chainsaw from the bed of his truck and began to cut up the fallen blockade. Meanwhile, Jacob pulled the logs and debris from the road. Mission accomplished. Kenny put away his saw, and he and Jacob were about to get in their vehicles and leave. But before they could even open their doors, an ear-splitting scream erupted from the woods behind them. Jacob walked over to Kenny and whispered, "That's what I was telling you about. I don't know what that thing is, man, but it looks like some kind of monster. And I think we need to get out of here, now." Kenny looked as though the blood had drained completely out of his face, became very pale, as he said to Jacob, "Jacob, man, I never mentioned this to anyone before now, but over the last few months, that thing has been killing off a few of my cows. Their throats are usually torn out, and the bodies are mangled and broken. I didn't want anyone to accuse me of being crazy and making stuff up, so I never said anything about it. But that's the reason I rushed over here when you called. I actually heard that sound a few times off in the distance at night, but never this close. So I think you are right, old buddy. It's time to go. Cautiously and with a sense of urgency, Jacob and Kenny climbed into their vehicles and made their way back into the blacktop. Both vehicles then began the 2.5-mile trek that led back to Jacob's house so they could decide what course of action should be taken. Jacob could feel the temperature drop as snow began to gently fall. He then reached over and turned his wipers on as snow began to pelt the windshield harder. As he passed his neighbor, William Springer's farm, he noticed a herd of deer grazing in the field that bordered his own property. Having put a distance between himself and the nightmare he had just encountered, Jacob felt a renewed sense of security as his fatigued nerves began to calm down. Not willing to let this opportunity pass him by, Jacob turned on his hazard lights and pulled to the shoulder of the road and signaled Kenny to do the same. Kenny knew what Jacob was thinking as he pulled in behind him and turned his ignition off. Getting out of his truck, Kenny said, "What are you doing, man? We need to get out of here now." Jacob said, "I know, and we will. In just a minute, man. I just can't turn this down. I have to take the shot. That's a 6-point buck standing there. It's not the trophy that I wanted, but at least I won't end up going home empty-handed. And after what happened this morning, I think I deserve a little something good. Alright, just take the shot so we can go. I still don't feel right about this," Kenny said. Jacob steadied his rifle across the hood of his truck. He zeroed in on the buck and was getting ready to fire. That's when he heard Kenny make a gasping noise and whisper, "Oh my God, what is it, man? What's wrong with you?" "Raise your scope 3 inches, he said. Raising the scope, Jacob immediately saw what had been the cause of Kenny's alarm. Standing just outside a tree line in the edge of the field was the creature that they had left behind. Not even 5 minutes. Was this thing following them? Was it after the deer? What was it doing? Jacob watched the creature through his scope for a full 30 seconds before it even moved, and when it did, it ignored him and the deer and started to walk towards William's barn that was just about 500 yards from where the woodland demon had been standing. Jacob called out to Kenny and said, "Kenny, call William and tell him that there is something trying to get into his barn. I know he has livestock in there, and if that thing gets in it, it will kill all of them." Attempting to get rid of this monster, werewolf, wendigo, or whatever it was, Jacob fired a shot, but missed. The creature turned towards them and glared at them through red, hate-filled eyes, and then began to run towards them at full steam. Kenny, who was still on the phone with William, screamed at Jacob to get in his truck and go. Jacob did as he was told, and Kenny followed right behind him. Starting their trucks, Jacob and Kenny both raced to Jacob's house as though they were driving on the NASCAR circuit. Arriving at home, Jacob, gun in hand, ran inside to get a phone book so that they could call the game warden and the police and get some kind of animal control out there to get rid of this thing. Jacob had just stepped out of his front porch when they heard gunfire coming from over at William's place. Dropping the phone book and running back inside, Jacob grabbed his 12-gauge shotgun and some shells and handed them to Kenny, who took little time in loading it. Jacob and Kenny, now locked and loaded, walked together to their truck and got ready to mount up a rescue for their neighbor William. Simultaneously, both of them stopped in their tracks as a familiar but uneasy feeling crept over them, and Jacob's 2 German shepherds began to whimper and ran under the front porch to hide. Kenny, whose throat had gone dry as a bone, whispered to Jacob and said, I have a really bad feeling about this." No sooner had the words escaped his lips, they heard a scream erupt from the forest, off to their right, and the creature exploded from the trees in front of them. Until now, neither man had been able to fully appreciate the colossal size and scope of the beast, but standing less than 30 feet away from them, they were almost overcome by the sheer magnitude of it. Jacob had seen it up close earlier from his truck while sitting down, and had guessed the height at maybe 8 feet. But now, standing there, looking up, he could tell that this fellow was 8.5 or 9 feet tall, and would tip the scale at 800 to 1,000 pounds. It had inhuman long arms that were easily seen beneath its long shabby black hair, which covered it from head to toe. The chest was larger than a 55-gallon drum, and there was little doubt that it could have pulled the arms off an ape, and now it stood there, staring at them. Jacob and Kenny both opened fire without hesitation. The creature screamed with rage as the bullets tore into its massive body, knocking it to the ground, but not killing or seriously injuring it. Jacob and Kenny watched speechless as it crawled into the tree line, struggled to its feet, and limped away. Jacob ran back to the porch and grabbed the phone book and called the local game warden. Nearly 2 hours later, Gene, the local warden, showed up to take their statements and told them that he had been called out to answer numerous such reports in the area, but he wasn't sure what to make of all these reports. "Guys," he said, "I don't know what to tell you. There is no animal in this area, or any area for that matter that fits your description. I'm not saying I don't believe you, I just don't know what it is." Jacob, whose face was reddened with anger, said, "Come here. Here's the blood from where we shot it, and here are the footprints." A look of complete confusion washed over Gene's face, and he asked if they would care to go with him as he tried to track it. Jacob and Kenny agreed, but they said they weren't going without a gun. Gene stated that he planned to take his gun as well. All three men loaded their guns and set out following the tracks and droplets of blood that had fallen on the leaves. They followed the trail for about a mile until arriving at a creek that was located deep in Jacob's woods, where the tracks that they were following were joined by others just like them. Some were smaller, but at least one set was larger. Deciding that the safest course of action would be to return home, they all went back to Jacob's. None of them gave up the idea of staying out in the woods longer, since there was now apparently more than one creature, and the cloudy overcast day made the forest seem even darker than it would normally be this time of day. Back at Jacob's, Gene informed them that there was nothing left that he could do but file it under an unknown animal sighting, which made both Kenny and Jacob anything but happy. Jacob and Kenny spent the next couple of days trying to warn their neighbors to use caution when they were out in the forest. Most of their friends just laughed at them and said they had most likely just seen a bear or something. No one believed them except William, who had also seen it himself the same day they had. He had even taken a shot at it, but missed. Jacob, William, and Kenny knew what they had seen, and they knew it was still out there, and they didn't care who believed them and who didn't. Over the next few weeks, more and more neighbors began to take the story a little more seriously, as family pets began to disappear, and other pets were found mangled. Other farms in the area began to find their cows and other livestock torn open, with their throats ripped out. Just a week after shooting the creature in his yard, Jacob's own German Shepherd was found dead, with its throat torn out, and it was hanging across a limb in a tree in his front yard. It almost seemed like a revenge killing. A few days later, one of William's new animals died the same way. Some people in the area still don't believe. They think the whole story was made up. But Jacob and Kenny know that there is still something out there in the forest. They still occasionally find tracks, or a slaughtered cow or goat. They still hear the blood-curdling screams off into the woods at night. They know that there is still something out there, watching and waiting biding its time. Something cold and cunning and cruel. Something not human, with a taste for blood and revenge. I'll tell you something that is true and real. My grandpa lived in Utah. He always told me stories about skinwalkers and how they could take the form of any animal or anyone that you know. I asked him one day if he had ever met one. He told me that he did, a long time ago when he was, and he said, young and foolish. It was long before I was born, or even my mother. He explained that he had gone to the valley. He called it Skinwalker Valley. He said it was a valley where nothing living ever ventures out, and where even crows, the guardians of death itself, won't go. It's a place of darkness and evil. He told me he went out there one day because he wanted to show others there was nothing to fear. Nothing but city superstition. He said he went out there in his old pickup truck, red in color but faded. When he found the valley, he saw that the grass on the ground and all of the trees were black. He said that the trees were still living though, and not far from where he exited his truck, he said there was a house. It was very old. The roof had fallen in and the door was gone. When he got closer to it, he said he noticed what looked to be deep scratches or claw marks on the side walls. He also described seeing the scattered bones and partial skeletons of animals all over the place, as if he had wandered into some sacred burial ground. As he is standing outside the house, he dares not to go in. He hears the voice of his grandmother, but she had died some time prior. Then there were other voices. They were calling to him, calling for his life, his skin, his blood, and even for his spirit and soul. He knew them to be the voices of the lost, those who could change from man to beast. He quickly ran back to his truck, convinced that he was being pursued every step of the way. Right after that, and for some time to come, he would find possessions of his, even if they were brand new and unused, broken, torn, missing, or even, as was the case with some of the family's animals, dead. It even got to the point where he wouldn't let his dog stay outside at night. And to show me that he wasn't lying, and he made me promise I wouldn't tell my mother, he pulled up his shirt and showed me these deep and ugly scars along his back. He told me that they were made by the claws of the skinwalker that chased him back to his truck. His only warning to me was to never look a skinwalker in the eye. If you do, it will never forget you and mark you for life. It will have your soul. My grandfather passed away recently. At his ceremony, my uncle laughed in a way that was kind of uncomfortable. Joked that he always thought my grandpa was a skinwalker himself. I'm 25 years old. I live in Utah, and I'm curious if any of you have seen anything like this before. I'm pretty sure I saw a Wendigo or a skinwalker. I know it sounds strange or crazy. I don't really believe in those things, and I'm really skeptical when it comes to the paranormal. This happened to me when I was 17 and in high school living with my parents. My house at the time was in a very small town. The backyard faced open, empty fields and mountains for miles before you could even reach another civilization at all. My best friend lived next door and shared this field as our backyard in a way. Also, by the way, I have to explain that his house was built on a different street that ended in a field. I think there was supposed to be more houses built down the street to expand the town, but they clearly never got around it. So this was where his driveway was at, even though no other houses were built there. The reason I'm saying this is because this matters later on in the story. I used to stay the night at my friend's house a lot in high school because I didn't have the best relationship with my parents. Every once in a while we would wake up to hear dragging and a weird gargling sound from the back porch. His room was a basement room with a window well to the back porch. It would happen maybe a couple times a month, but whenever we would gather the courage to check, nothing would be back there, and this happened for many years. However, there is one specific night that haunts my friend and I to this day. My friend was getting ready to move, and we would stay up all night playing games and watching movies. So we decided to go on a music drive to just vibe. So we hopped in his truck with high beams and swung out of the driveway, turning them on towards the field to use the roundabout. The light of the vehicle illuminated this thing. It looked like a person, but it wasn't. It was naked on all fours, abnormally large, its limbs that seemed to fold under itself in an unnatural way. Its pale skin was clung to it, like it had to be stretched onto it. But the part that still sends shivers down my spine is its face. Its jaw hung open to this gaping black maw, like a snake unhinging its jaw to eat. Its black eyes glistened in the light as it looked at us. But just as it turned to see us, it quickly scurried backwards, almost like it was on rewind, into the brush of the field. My friend and I were pale as a ghost. We both looked at each other like, "Did you see that too?" We were shaken. Let's just say we tried to have a good rest of the night, but we couldn't believe what we saw. We ended up just sitting there in his basement with guns ready and waiting to hear the gargling and dragging again, but we never did. Sorry that the story doesn't have a climax, but I swear to you, all of this is true. I now don't live in that town anymore. There are times when I do go visit, and that empty field still feels like it's watching and waiting. Even though I can't see it, I can still feel like it's out there, somewhere, waiting for me. I had only 2 encounters with a skinwalker, both at our house in Window Rock, Arizona. By the way, we are Navajo. The first encounter was when I was playing around with the PlayStation. My sister and her boyfriend are on the couch. The front door is wide open. There's no screen door. It is nighttime, summer, and hot. I put the game down and feel compelled. I don't know why, but I just walk out onto the porch. At first, I don't notice anything out of the ordinary, but I do feel a bit anxious. As I turn to come back inside, out of the corner of my eye and to the far side of the yard, I see this figure, dark against dark, moving across the lawn. I then catch the smell of rotten meat. I call into the house for my sister and her boyfriend. They come outside as well, and the 3 of us watch as this critter gets up on 2 feet, strolls into the trees at the edge of the property, and paying us no mind. It then disappears into the dark. Moments later, and off in the distance, we hear this chanting. It's in Navajo, and it sounds as if it's coming from everywhere at once. And then it just stops. My second encounter happened about 2 years after the first one. I'm outside in our backyard, in the same property, but it's later in the day, but not quite night. The sun is still out, but it's a bit orange in the sky, and just below the tops of the trees to the west. Way out at the end of the property, where we have these bushes, and just before the woods, I see this figure. It's crouched down and looking at me. Then it just stands, but it's not very tall, not even 5 feet. At first, I think it's a man, but from what I can tell, it's not wearing any clothes. And if it is naked, it isn't skin and bones, not like any person I have ever seen. But before I could call out or anything else, it turns and lopes off, very awkward, with its shoulders rolling from side to side and its arms hanging way too low. My boyfriend Jason and I, we went on a month-long camping trip to multiple states. Everything was going really well until October 9th. We decided to ditch a campground reservation and randomly pitch our tent near Albion Basin with the Uinta Mountains in Utah, not far off the secret lake trailhead. We parked our vehicle around 3 p.m. at the Albion Basin campground, which was closed for the season. It was a little tense because this was our first dispersed camping attempt, and we had no proper backpacking gear. When we arrived, we realized that the area we wanted to pitch our tent was about 2 miles uphill. At this point, we started to express regret, as we had a planned campsite in Nephi, Utah, that we decided to skip on a whim. After grumping around a bit and having a large lunch to avoid packing food, we packed our backpacks with the best gear we had to get through the night, as it was going to be 25 degrees Fahrenheit. We set out up the trail, seeing the occasional family or couple heading down the mountain. As we walked, we both started to feel a bit strange, as if we didn't really even know why we were doing this. We should have just gotten in a hotel instead of trying to play backpackers for the night. But we both felt like we had something to prove, so we continued. We made it up to Secret Lake, totally empty, so nothing like the pictures, disappointing and eerie. We keep hiking up in an attempt for seclusion and flat land when we stumble across a decent space. I see a small cave in the distance and point it out to Jason to deliberate if it's a hell no kind of situation. But after he checked it out, he says it seems like a small animal crawl space. No biggie. We set up as nightfall was quickly approaching, played some cards, bundled up, and decided to go to bed early around 8:30 p.m. as we planned to leave ASAP in the morning, maybe around 5 a.m. We both dwindle slowly, and after what feels like 30 minutes, at 11:24 p.m., I woke up with a feeling I have never experienced before. I woke up wide awake, scared, when I always sleep through the night. Jason was asleep, so I let him be and just lie there, alert, trying to listen to anything I could hear, which was nothing, very silent. Around 12 a.m., Jason woke up stirring, much to my delight, as I didn't want to feel alone anymore. I told him I couldn't sleep, but he suggested I just rest my eyes as we were leaving early in the morning. I agreed, initially not wanting to be a baby and say I was very scared. This, however, was very short-lived, as Jason could not fall back asleep himself, and we ended up laying there together, trying to sleep, when I ended up blurting out that I was scared. We agreed it was time for us to just stick it through the night, as it was now approaching 2:30 a.m., and we had a small axe and a pellet gun for protection, so I didn't need to be feeling too scared. Not even 5 minutes later, we're still wide awake, and Jason's head perks up so fast my heart jumped out of my chest, and I whispered, "What is it?" He replied, "Listen." And I shit you not, we heard the sound of gravel crunching under boots, as if someone walked up to our tent, stopped, and then walked to my side. I felt the blood drain out of my face in an instant. In real time, this all occurred in no more than 10 seconds. But my mind flashed a million thoughts, and for a second, I was convinced it was a ranger coming to tell us we could not camp there. So I called out, "Hello?" My brain entirely sure I heard human footsteps. But within 2 to 3 seconds of hearing the footsteps, Jason grabbed a gun and bursted out for any chance to confront this person, as I knew he heard exactly what I had heard. But nothing. There was nothing there. As soon as Jason bursted out, and me after him, there was nothing there. We heard something walk up so clearly, but nothing walked away, barely exchanging 2 words. We packed up our stuff, looking over our shoulders, terrified, feeling like we were being watched, and booked it down the mountain with only moonlight guiding our way, too scared to turn on our flashlights. This was the worst 20-30 minutes of my life, half expecting to look over my shoulder to find someone following us. When we made it to our car, we locked the doors and started going down the mountains, almost speechless and scared out of our minds. At this point, we reached town around 3:30 a.m. and slept in a well-lit parking lot of a grocery store. We have obviously discussed what happened that night, and we are both haunted by the sound of those footsteps. My mother is visiting my brother's family just east of Nevada. My brother and his wife have a night out, and mom's watching over the kids, who are 3 and 5 years old at the time. She has just gotten them off to bed and goes into the living room to watch her programs. She nods off in front of the TV and is awakened around 11:30. She says that she hears whistling, not the bored, absent-minded kind, but by someone who is really good at it. She finds it strange that someone would be outside at this time of night, not only whistling, but seemingly close to the house. She goes over to the picture window. The moon is bright, the reflection casting a pale glow upon the rooftops of the nearby houses that are on the reservation. When suddenly, dogs from the neighbors all start barking at once. They sound scared, and they are barking like if it's a warning. Despite the noise, she now hears a different whistle, the kind the police use or sports officials, and it's coming from there, by the road, which runs along the side of the house. She puts on her robe and goes out to the porch and around to that side of the house. There in the road is this guy, who when he notices her standing there, says that he's the local medicine man. He holds up his whistle like it's some kind of badge. He then tells her there is a skinwalker running through the neighborhood and that she should go back inside and lock the door. My brother finds out the next day from the neighbors that there was a critter of some sort jumping from one roof to the next. So anybody listening to this, if you ever hear whistling out at night, don't go outside. If you hear any noises outside your window at night, don't go outside. And whatever you do, don't ever say a word or whistle back. I am Navajo. We had an incident with an unwelcome visitor in our home. Here's what happened. My cousin is sleeping over. He's the same age as me. We're both 13 at this time. We're in my room, talking and hanging out. It is around maybe 11 p.m. It is a pleasant summer evening, so my window is wide open. It's also pretty dark outside, and my dad is in the living room watching TV. But as always, he's dozed off on the couch. My mom has already gone to bed. My cousin and I are keeping it down, but we're not ready yet to call it a night. All of a sudden, we hear the screen door to the front of the house open and slam shut. We think it's my dad. My mom, she tells us the next day she hears footsteps on the carpet. Whoever it is, she says, goes through her room and towards the bathroom, so she naturally assumes it's my dad. Then she realizes that she's unable to move, as if she's paralyzed. Still, in my room, my cousin and I again hear the screen door open and slam, only this time more loud. It wakes up my dad, and he comes to my bedroom to check on us. Finding us both there, he wants to know which one of my friends just slipped out of the house. It takes a few minutes, but we convince him we were by ourselves, and that we thought it was him going in and out. I can see by the look on his face, he's not really buying it, but he has to admit we don't seem to be lying. He then leaves, and as he's closing the door to my room, he tells us to stay out of trouble and go to sleep. All we could do is shrug. The next morning, my mom tells us about what she heard and how she could not move. She also tells us that the second time the door slams, she then hears what sounds like a horse galloping by her bedroom window. She then has all of us pray, and now, every year, we hike up the mountain to a high point and we pray for protection from evil. This event happened just south of Polaca, Arizona, within the Navajo reservation. A pair of skinwalkers, they say an old couple that lived deep back in the reservation, were seen lurking around this small cattle ranch. 2 heifers had disappeared recently, one of which was discovered down by the creek and mutilated. The man who owned the ranch, his 2 sons, and his brother armed themselves and went out to try to run them off. One of the sons, not yet 18 years of age, was searching out beyond the barn when a dark shape, materializing from the darkness itself, loomed up in front of him, almost nose to nose. As the boy attempted to raise his rifle, the figure raised its hands up to its face as if it was going to yell something. The boy, trying not to look at it in the eyes, then felt something rush into his face, like dust or sand. Even though he tried not to, he ended up taking a breath, and some of it was inhaled in. Immediately, things went dark, and he started experiencing hallucinations. The others found him only minutes later, on his knees, holding the sides of his head, and his eyes rolled back. He fell to the ground and went into some sort of trance. His body limped, and he became unresponsive. They carried him back to the house, and they summoned the local medicine man, who came and said some prayers over him, but he told the others there was nothing to be done but to wait for the dust, traces of which were still on his face and his shirt, to wear off. He promised he would come back the next day when the sun was up and bless the Hogan. Later, after he had regained consciousness, the boy swore to the others that he was the victim of a dog-faced creature. He described it as not quite as tall as he is, thin and scraggly, with patches of mangy and dark hair. a canine snout, only shorter than a dog's, and with the smell of rotten eggs or worse. He said he doesn't recall anything more before passing out, other than not being able to breathe and having no control over his own body. Before I begin, I would like to say that this is a very long story. It's been something that's haunted me since I was 6 years old. Since my first encounter with it, I had dreams about this, and 2 very specific encounters with the creature. I'm sharing this story so I could possibly find help on what to do or how to get rid of this creature that's been hunting me since I can remember. Just for background, I'm a 21-year-old female and still worry about this creature finding me, but I'll get into detail why later. For now, here's my story. I would always go camping with my grandparents, who I call my Gammy and Gampy, at the end of my school years. I would always look forward to it, since I grew up loving the outdoors and the woods. I especially loved camping, loving the idea of having s'mores, taking long hikes, being around the campfire, and of course, the wildlife that we would see. Now, I grew up in California, mostly near cities, so the forest was like my true home to me. I always prefer being near trees and dirt instead of buildings and crowded places. Besides, the woods were more quiet and more peaceful. I always felt safe when I was there, like nothing could ever hurt me. But something strange would always happen at the end of the month of May. I would have this reoccurring dream during the last week of my school year. I would be in the woods, walking alone down a dirt trail. The woods were always quiet. I would continue to walk this path until I saw this red fox poke its head from behind a tree. Its eyes were always strangely human-like, but they were yellow and somehow looked like teddy bear eyes, and it would always just stare at me. It wouldn't make a sound at all. It would just watch me. Usually, in my dream, I would go up and pet it, making the fox finally make a noise, mostly a soft growl. Then I would continue walking, and it would follow me. The first time I would have this dream was when I was actually around 5 years old, and it lasted until I was about 11. As the years went by, it would be the same exact thing. I would walk in the woods, find this fox, pet it, then continue on with my hike with it alongside me. But when I was having the same dream, on the 4th time, it would start to walk behind me. That's when I started to feel uneasy about this fox. I could hear it making odd noises, but every time I went back to look, it was just walking, like nothing was wrong, even somehow giving me a smile. Sorry to go on about a dream, but I now believe that this was a warning of the creature. Now that the dream is out the way, I can talk about my first true encounter. I was 6 years old, and I was going on a camping trip with my Gammy and Gampy for about a week. Of course, I was very excited. I was barely able to keep myself in school for the last day of kindergarten. They had picked me up right as the bell had rung, and already had the camping trailer attached to my Gampy's truck. I remember he drove an old red truck that only had 3 seats, with me being always in the middle. It took about 2 hours to get there, and another good hour to find our usual camping spot. It was deep into the woods and far from other people, as my Gammy wasn't too fond of being around other people while we were camping. As they were setting up the camping trailer, I wandered around the campsite, loving to dig in the dirt for bugs. I had sat down on the dirt and started to dig. But I noticed how quiet the woods were. It was never quiet, not even in the dead of night. I thought it was odd, but being only 6, I didn't think too hard about it. As I continued to dig for bugs, however, I thought I heard my gammy call for me. She would always call me Sugar Booger, that being a nickname she gave me since I was born. That's what I had heard, but it sounded like she was very far away and somewhat sick. Sugar Booger. I looked up where I heard it coming from, which was from the woods, but there was no way she was there, because she was still unloading stuff from the truck. Even at the age of 6, it didn't feel right, so I walked closer to my grandparents and stayed next to them. I soon forgot about this weird encounter I had as we began to have fun. For the rest of the day, we played card games, sat next to the campfire as we ate dinner, and stared up into the stars. I always loved seeing the stars. There was never any where I lived at. We started to get sleepy around 9 p.m., I believe, and we started to get ready for bed. There were bunk beds that me and my gammy would sleep on, keeping our luggage on the top bunk, and we would sleep on the bottom bunk. Due to my gampy snoring, he would sleep on the couch of the trailer. I would always sleep next to the trailer window, just in case I couldn't sleep and wanted to look outside. I fell asleep pretty quickly though, that being the last day of school and all. It was pretty exhausting. I remember waking up maybe hours later. It was still pitch black outside. It wasn't weird for me to wake up late in the night, since I always had sleeping issues. I rolled onto my side, trying to fall back asleep, until I heard Sugar Booger. My eyes immediately shot open as I heard my nickname being spoken, but I knew it wasn't either of my grandparents. They were both asleep, and they were never known to sleep talk before. I started to feel this horrible feeling in my gut, like whatever I was hearing wanted to really hurt me. Even at the age of 6, I knew this wasn't normal. Then I started to hear tapping at the trailer window. It was soft, but loud enough for me to hear it. I just sat there, frozen in fear. I was trying to just brush it off as tree branches or rain, but I just knew it wasn't it. I could tell it was really someone or something tapping on the window. Then I decided to be brave and look. Big mistake. I pulled the curtain away to only peek, and all I saw were these large yellow eyes. They seemed glassy, yet not real. They looked like giant teddy bear eyes, but cold and unwelcoming. I remember in that moment I panicked and quickly closed the curtain back up. I then hid under the blanket, that being the only thing I knew to do when I saw a monster. I could feel tears falling down my face. I never had been so terrified in my life. I just curled up into my gammy's side and clung to her all night long. That damn tapping only getting louder and more persistent throughout the night. I don't remember falling asleep, but somehow I did. I do remember my gampy waking me up around noon, saying how if I got up quick enough, we could still go fishing, but I didn't want to leave the trailer at all, terrified that whatever I saw the night before would still be out there. I did eventually go outside, but I was just looking around, horrified that whatever saw me last night would get me. My gammy immediately knew I was scared and pulled me into a hug when she saw me, asking me what was wrong. I did tell her what I saw and heard, and to my surprise, she believed me. The next thing I know, she was telling my gampy that we were moving campsites. It took a bit to convince him, but he did eventually start to pack up and hook the trailer onto his truck. I was put into the truck so I could fall asleep but I just couldn't. I kept feeling that I was being watched, thinking that every little noise was that thing I saw, that if I closed my eyes even for a second, it would get me. My gammy wasn't too far from me when I heard it again, but this time it was my actual name, Aaliyah. In that moment, I had never seen my gammy move so fast. She looked up into the bushes where we heard it, then to me. She then got in the truck with me and pulled me into a tight, protective hug. I began to cry all over again, telling her how I wanted to just go back home. That's when my Gampy got into the truck as well, and since I was crying so hard to the point I was coughing, he agreed we could go home. We started to head out the campsite, still hurt that this trip had been ruined by something, but I still didn't know what. That's when something in my head told me to look back. I slowly did, feeling an ice-cold fear wash over me as I saw something, a red fox, sitting in the middle of the campsite, sitting there with large, yellow eyes, the same red fox from my dream, somehow curling its lips into an eerie smile. After that encounter, we never did go back to that campsite. We did continue to camp, but in more populated areas. I never told my grandma what I saw, but she had told me to trust my gut. She knew that I was sensitive to certain entities, and that would help me if I trusted it. Now, this would be the end of the story, but I'm afraid it isn't. There was one more encounter I had with the creature, and it was much more terrifying than the first time. The second encounter I had was when I was 17, many years later. By this time, I knew very well what a skinwalker was now, and I was still very paranoid every time I went near wooded areas. I still worried about seeing that fox, but I never really thought about it too much. Me and my 2 younger siblings were staying at a relative's house for Christmas, them living way up into a mountain area. I think they were my great aunt and uncle, but I'm not sure. Where they lived, there was no service at all, so unless we hooked up into their Wi-Fi, we had no phone. I didn't mind the house. I was still loving the woods, no matter what happened. Even though at night, I hated how they didn't close the window curtains, making it easy for anything outside to see inside. But I did feel safe while inside the house, knowing that they wouldn't let anything hurt us. Lucky for all of us, it didn't snow where they lived, so we could go outside and run around. They also had this beautiful black lab. She was about a year old. Her name was Pam. She was very playful and normally wouldn't listen to anyone but my uncle. One of the days we were there, my little sister and our aunt went out to the store for a nice girl's day. Even though I'm a girl, I wanted to go hiking with my uncle and my little brother. We left pretty early since the hike we were doing was 4 hours of walking into town. It was a really chilly morning, but since we were doing so much walking, it felt great. We also decided to take Pam. It was a good way for her to get some exercise and have fun. About maybe an hour into our walk, I started to slow down a bit, wanting to enjoy the beautiful forest. It was so peaceful, I could have stayed there, but as we continued to walk, I started to feel something odd. I noticed how quiet the forest had become. Hearing only footsteps and my brother talking to our uncle, Pam noticed it too, her ears going straight up and growling softly. I started to pick up my pace to get next to my brother. I was worried that possibly a coyote or mountain lion was nearby, but I knew that they wouldn't be out at this time though. Even if they were, they didn't walk near the roads. My little brother was only 9 at that time, and being the oldest sibling, my natural instincts to protect him kicked in. My uncle noticed the silence as well, telling us to stay close to him and Pam, who was now next to me and still growling. I began to feel that horrible feeling again, that ice cold fear I once felt when I was 6. I tried so hard to not think of the creature, but it was all I could worry about. I was scared. I felt like I was back to being that scared little 6-year-old girl again. I had to stop for a moment though, seeing my shoelace came undone. I quickly kneeled down to tie it back up, trying to hurry and just get out of there. And that's when I heard it. Aaliyah. In that moment, my heart dropped into my stomach. My eyes were widened, and I could just feel myself start to shake from fear. It was right next to me. I heard it, clear as day. I slowly turned my head, and there it was. That same red fox, still having those horrid yellow eyes, and that same demented smile. Only this time, I saw it much more clearly. Its fur looked so matted and disgusting. The smell it had was like rotten, decaying flesh mixed with garbage. Its limbs were much too long for a normal fox, the back legs bending completely the wrong way. Those eyes were still the worst thing about it, but now they looked emptier than I had remembered. I wanted to scream, to run, to cry, but I just couldn't. I was frozen as I was, too scared to even blink. Then I heard it speak again. This time, however, it had mimicked my little brother's voice. Found you. Before anything else could happen, Pam suddenly jumped in front of me and started to bark like mad, snapping and growling so aggressively that it scared me out of my frozen trance. When I looked back, it was gone. I used that moment to run over to my brother and uncle, who didn't see what I saw, as they were too far ahead now. But I heard my uncle start to pray and sing a song under his breath, keeping my brother and myself close to him. I was just too scared to even look back, so I just kept my eyes on the ground and refused to stop walking. Pam had stopped barking, but she was still growling and never left my side as we continued our hike. My little brother was a bit worried, but he just thought it was a coyote. When we finally made it into town, my uncle had called our aunt and told her to pick us up, saying something about how it wasn't safe for us to walk back. Thankfully, she did come and get us, but she was confused since we talked about that hike for days. On the car ride back, Pam never left me alone. She was right with me the entire time. She knew that thing was after me, and she was protecting me. I was very grateful that she was with us. Who knows what would have happened if she wasn't. When we got back to the house, I was talked to by my uncle and aunt. I told them what happened and what I saw, and then they started to pray and check that all the locks were shut tight. My aunt started putting something around the doors. I now believe it was most likely ashes, but I never did find out. Unfortunately, this made our Christmas vacation cut short, as they were worried that I was not safe while still in the woods. We had to be taken home the next day. They made an excuse of how there was an emergency with a friend and that they had to help them out. I felt horrible that this Christmas was ruined, but once I did leave the woods, I truly felt safe again. Before they had to drive back home though, they told me that it wasn't my fault, and that lucky for all of us, it didn't hurt me or the other kids. It did make me feel a bit better, but it still brought up a lot of questions and worries. It was still around. How? Why? What did it want from me? Does it want my skin? My soul? Was I just going to be tormented by this thing forever? I still don't have answers to these questions, and that's what really scares me. Now, I have long moved from California, and now live in Kentucky. I do live in the woods, but so far, that thing hasn't found me. I know that seems very stupid on my part, but life had changed a lot when I was growing up. I was given no other option to live somewhere else, and my grandpa in Kentucky was kind enough to let me live with him. So please don't call me an idiot for moving to the woods when I had no other choice. Anyways, I am happy it hasn't found me, but I'm still worried. Can it still find me? Is it still hunting me? I'm not close to anyone who knows truly on how to get rid of this thing, and that's why I'm telling my story now, so I can possibly find help. So please, if there's anyone out there who does know, please help me. My friend and I were at a party on the Hopi reservation in Polaca. It was getting late, and we had a pretty good buzz on. Most of the people we knew had already trickled out, so we decided it was a good time as any to leave. We looked around for the friend who was supposed to give us a ride, because we had all come together. We found him in a back bedroom, drunk and passed out. So we had no choice. We're gonna have to walk. The two of us lived on the other side of the gulch. A good 2 miles. Between were nothing but trees, scrubs, bushes, and some hills. We had barely cleared the houses onto the road passing between the wooded area when we got this funny feeling we were being watched. We decided to leave the road and cut through the trees. It wasn't the easiest walk, but it would cut the distance down some. And even though it was pitch black outside, we knew the way pretty well. We had been a good 20 minutes off the road and heading up towards the hills when that same feeling of being watched came upon us again. We both turned around at the same time, but it was so dark we couldn't see anything. But then, my friend Paul swore he heard some kind of cackling or mumbling. I didn't hear anything, except for maybe the wind in the top of the trees at our back. By that time, none of us was gonna admit it. We were feeling a little scared. Without saying a single word, we picked up the pace, moving along pretty good but not running. And that's when I heard it too. But now, it was more like heavy breathing. Paul then grabbed my arm and gave me a tug forward. We took off running straight up the hill, which wasn't that big, but it was still enough of a slope so I wasn't feeling it in my legs. And on top of that, I was drunk. Think about this for a second. Running up a hill, at night, drunk, complete darkness, and as you're running, you hear footsteps behind you, and heavy breathing. Whatever it was though, stayed with us every step of the way. Right at the top, Paul and I stopped and turned around, expecting the thing to be right on us. But we were standing there, huffing and puffing, and looking at nothing but darkness. A few seconds passed, and then we heard a thin laughter, as if it was coming from down the hill and back from where we started running. We decided to keep moving and put some distance between us. We turned to go down the other side of the hill, and there, standing right in front of us, was this creature. It was standing up on 2 legs, like a circus dog, only much taller, with both paws extended out in front of it. It had this coyote face, and it was grinning at us, all of its teeth exposed, and its tongue sliding from one side to the other. I couldn't believe how skinny it was, as if it hadn't eaten in weeks. Its rounded stomach sticking out like one of those African kids in the charity ads, and the skin sinking between its ribs. The smell was unbelievably bad, like the smell of an old, wet dog. We both jumped back with a scream, like 2 little schoolgirls. As we did, the creature dropped down on all fours and ran past us and down the hill back where we had come from. It was yipping and laughing all the way. Paul and I started praying like never before, swearing to Jesus that if he got us home safe, we would never drink again. The laughing, or whatever you want to call it, died down and disappeared. Wasting no time, the two of us made our way down that hill and into the trees that separated us from where we lived. As we walked along, we were trying to convince each other everything was okay. It was only a coyote out searching for a meal. We scared it jumped up at us, and then it ran away. We started feeling better about things overall. We got across the open field and into the trees. We made it all the way through there without anything else happening. However, just as we stepped out towards that first backyard that we needed to cut through to get to the street, we heard this unmistakable chatter, like some little monkey laughing, coming out of the trees just behind us. It was followed by the sound of something moving through the branches and twigs. My friend Paul then yelled out some words that he said that his grandmother had taught him, and just like that, the noise ceased and it got real quiet. He then grabbed my arm again and we ran. We ran as fast as we could through that yard and out to the road. We ran straight for the house where Paul lives with his grandmother. When we got there, we found her awake and sitting in the kitchen with only a small candle for light. She was burning some cedar. When she saw us, she put her finger up to her lips and then pointed to the outside of the house. Her lips were moving, but silently. We stood there still for a minute or two, and then she spoke out loud, saying it was okay. She then said a prayer, and that the Skinwalker was now gone. I have no idea how she knew, and I didn't care. Needless to say, I spent the rest of the night there, sleeping where I knew I would be safe. Do you love Native American legends? Have you heard of the Goat Man? No? Then please, allow me to enlighten you. I heard the legend when a power outage on our reservation made us decide to have a fire. As we all know, nothing goes better with a good fire than a good story. That's where I learned about the Goat Man. The legend goes that they shapeshift. They love human forms most of all, which is what makes them so dangerous. It's also said that if you find a bone of one, take a picture and keep it in your house. It will wait. For what though, you may ask? The answer is they wait for you to leave. Once you leave, they ransack the place until they find what you took from them. There was even an incident about that night that I heard of, where some people met the Goat Man face to face. It was a night like the one I was experiencing. Some men had decided to have a fire in the desert, and they told some stories about it. Then a stranger walked out of the desert and took a seat, never speaking a word. No one really got a good look at the stranger. One man brought up the legend of the Goat Man, causing the stranger to listen a little more closely. At the end, the other men nervously laughed, and the stranger stayed silent. The man decided to go back to their homes and put out the fire. They didn't have enough room for the stranger, and they figured he could hitchhike back to town. They had just left when they saw something chasing after their truck. Afraid, they sped up, and the creature sped up its pursuit as well. When it reached the truck, it flipped over and dragged 3 men off into the night. What happened to them? Well, they were never found. So here I am, to warn you, and to be careful of the Goat Man. They can shapeshift, didn't I tell you? That homeless man begging for change that you encounter on your way home tonight could be one, or your boss, teacher, or even your friends. This happened about a week and a half ago. I live in Washington State. I'm a 14-year-old male. I'm homeschooled, so I don't leave the house much, and I live with my mom and my dad. It was March 7, 2022, at about 12 a.m. I was just listening to the old Jenna Marbles and Julian podcast from like 3 years ago and playing some video games. I was kind of tired, and I had just finished eating a snack, so I went to go brush my teeth and wash my face. I did all my business in the bathroom and came back to my room. When I opened the door, my cat was up in his cat tower, which is right next to my window, and his back was arched up. His hair on his back was all up, and he was hissing, which I had never heard him do. I look out the window, and standing there is my dad. This gave me a relief for a second, until I realized it wasn't my dad. It was taller than my dad, and its smile was weirdly big. My dad never just smiles at me, and he's never came up to my window before. What the fuck is that? I said as I ran out my room, crying and shaking, obviously, because I never seen anything like that before. I went to my mom, who was sleeping on the couch, and I shook her awake. I told her to go check if my dad was in the bedroom, and she asked why. And I told her I would tell her after she checked, and indeed, he was sleeping in the bedroom. I told her what happened, and she sort of believed me, but sort of didn't. So she went into my room and checked out my window. Whatever it was gone. She checked all the other windows and doors, and nothing was there. She even grabbed my cat, and we slept on the couch that night, all together. Today was the first day I was able to go back into my room, March 17, and I still haven't told my dad about it. I have no idea what it was that I saw, but the only thing I can think of is that it was a skinwalker. Anyway, I don't think I'll ever be able to forget this, and I'm still terrified that I'm gonna end up seeing it again. It's crazy. I looked behind my shoulder like 10 times while writing this. What the fuck? Two years ago, I went to go visit family up in North Minnesota around Labor Day weekend. I won't give the exact location, but will provide at least a general location where this happened. To keep it short, I'm hoping someone may have had similar experience, or may have had a general idea what this theme or entity was walking around our tent. On that Labor Day weekend, my girlfriend and I were planning on spending time camping with her family. Both of us were very excited to get away from the everyday city life, and we anticipated a much-needed low-key weekend. We arrived at their location around noon on Saturday, and were all greeted by everyone there. During the day and evening, we were enjoying ourselves with random fun activities, and catching up on how everyone was doing. As the night started to settle in, we were all near the campfire for a few hours until 11 p.m. Eventually, the family and ourselves called it a night, and we all headed to bed. My girlfriend and I were offered to sleep in a bigger size 6-person tent. It belonged to a relative who I will call Mary. It was a kind gesture at that time, as we only brought a 2-person sized tent. Having that additional space for our belongings and our air mattress was a nice added feature. Mary's tent was positioned not too far from the campfire and the rest of the family. The family did a wonderful job clearing and maintaining the area for their smaller RVs and additional tents. To the back of the tent, about 20 to 30 yards, is where the woods started with semi-thick brush and trees. Us three were laying down chatting, and eventually they both fell asleep. For some reason though, I couldn't sleep, so I was on my phone passing time, hoping to eventually drift off to sleep. This is when I heard a faint noise in the woods about 40 yards back. I dismissed it right away, as deer are known in this area, and I continued to space off on my phone looking at random things. About 10 to 20 minutes later, I heard something get closer to our tent. I could hear twigs snapping and moving between bushes getting closer to our area. This started to get my attention, as I could start physically feeling a faint shake in the ground as this thing was wandering around. Moments later, this thing was about 10 yards away from our area, walking, running back and forth. Whatever this thing was, with each step it took, I could physically feel the vibration from the ground. This thing was big, and the best way to describe this feeling is if you went to a live rock concert and you felt the kick drum hit your body. At this point, I was a bit terrified, as I was trying to follow the footsteps, walking or running at the back and the side of the tent. This thing got at least 5 yards near our area, and then suddenly it stopped where Mary was sleeping at, near her tent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, scared of what this thing was going to do next. I shit you not, a few seconds later, Mary shot up from being dead asleep. She gasped for air and was calling our names to wake us up. You could hear her voice. She was terrified. This thing hightailed off back into the woods. Both of us were very startled at this point. The woods had become dead silent, and eventually we got enough courage to look outside. We saw and heard nothing, and about 30 minutes later, we ran to the shop to grab a shotgun. Another anomaly during this whole thing, while we were alert and awake, Mary mentioned during this time I was awake that she was having a dream. She mentioned these things were tormenting her, saying they wanted her soul and to give it to them. My girlfriend dismissed the whole thing and said it was most likely just a deer, etc., running around. After hearing my girlfriend say that, I never told anyone about this story until recently, as I started to think about it again, trying to figure out what the hell this thing or entity was. My family has lived in Iowa since July of 2017, and we live in a small neighborhood with a minimum of 25 houses, and it is surrounded by a forest. I've seen many horror movies, and most of the movies are always in a forest, so I've been paranoid and been alarmed. Our dog was getting old, so we got another dog. And so now, our old dog has a friend. We named our new dog Tucker, and he is a very energetic dog with everyone and everything. Our old dog died a few months later, and Tucker was the only interactive pet we now had. A couple of years later, my mom and dad got divorced, and she moved on to a guy that lives a couple of miles away from our house. My mom and dad settle on a schedule on what day they can spend the day with us, while the other goes somewhere else for a couple of days. For context, my mom's side is native, and we do believe in the lore of skinwalkers and wendigos. On one of my mom's days, she drives up this road where it's surrounded by a bunch of trees and a couple of houses and 2 farms. There is a hill on this road that she has to drive up, and as my mom drove up the hill, she saw something in a field near the neighborhood. What she saw was tall, gray-skinned, had deer hoofs as feet, and it was walking into the woods. My mom was confused, and when she reached the stop sign, she looked back in her mirror, and nothing. Now my mom was scared, because she remembered all the stories of the Wendigo and Skinwalkers, and drove off to our house. When she told me this, I was already scared because of all the stories I had heard on YouTube. As she told the story, I remember the Skinwalker, mostly all the stories of the encounters I had found on YouTube. After this, I was extremely cautious when I was outside on my bike rides. Without thinking, I rode my bike near the hill where my mom saw the possible Wendigo. I brought my camera to take pictures of the landscape because it was nice out, but I became paranoid when I came near to the field, and I always trust my paranoia. As I rode off, I felt like I was being watched when I rode past the field. A couple of days later, it was nighttime, and my dog had to go outside to go to the bathroom. I put my dog on a leash that is connected to the porch, and I let Tucker out. I turned on the light that was outside so I could see what Tucker was doing, but I was cooking food in the kitchen for me, so I had to focus on that. When my food was finished, I heard my dog start barking at something, so I walked towards the door so I could see what he was doing. As I approached the door, I can see Tucker is barking at something in the dark. I opened the door more and told Tucker to stop barking and to get inside, because his barking could wake up the neighbors. After telling him to get inside, he kept barking at something in the darkness. My paranoia kicked in, and I shouted to him to get inside. He kept barking. That's when I started to get scared, and I finally looked into the darkness to see nothing but eyes shining from the porch light. As I saw those eyes, my instincts kicked in to pull on the leash and scream out, "Get inside!" Finally, Tucker responds by reacting to the pull and running towards the door, and I slammed the door as soon as Tucker ran inside. I shut the porch light off and took the leash off his collar. I locked every single door and window in the house and covered every window and anything that you can look through. After Tucker was off the leash, he ran downstairs into our basement, so I grabbed my food and went downstairs to keep an eye on my dog. It's been 2 months since then, and my routine when it got dark was what I did when I saw those eyes outside. Close the blinds, lock the doors, and turn off the lights from outside. Now, whenever I'm outside, I'm always with a group of people, or I always keep a weapon on me.